Now, we all know, Bob, that as a business, when the fight is big enough, you've worked with Don King, you've worked with De La Hoya, even Al Heyman. How do you make this happen?
Al Heyman, he refuses to allow any of his fighters to get beat by a top-ranked fighter. And if Terrence fights Errol Spence, there's one winner, and that's Terrence Crawford. That's Terrence Crawford. That's Terrence Crawford. That's Terrence Crawford fights Errol Spence. There's one winner, and that's Terrence Crawford. And Al Heyman refuses to allow it.
Welcome to the motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news.
Okay, we'll start with this. Well, Mike Kopinger tweeted, during a PBC on Fox segment with Deontay Wilder and Andy Ruiz, latter is described as the IBF and WBA champion in the graphic. No mention of his WBO title, an organization the PBC is no longer recognizing. It helps explain the omission of Terrence Crawford among the welterweight champions. For those of you out there who took in this past weekend's pay-per-view involving Manny Pacquiao, you may have noticed that they listed 4 quote-unquote champions in the welterweight division. One being Keith Thurman, the WBA Super, what was then the WBA Super, Manny Pacquiao, who was the WBA regular, Sean Porter, who holds the WBC title, and Errol Spence, who holds the IBF title. But what they failed to mention is that there is another champion at the weight, and we all know who that champion is. That champion is Terrence Crawford. And what Mike Kopinger is suggesting here is that the PBC as a brand, as a managerial or promotional or whatever kind of outfit they are disavowing any knowledge of the WBO and any of their champions. What effect could this have, and what does this all mean for the sport of boxing?
Moving forward.
It seems painfully obvious to me that this is just another indication of what I've been telling you guys, that the PBC is very much determined to operate as an island, independent of the rest of the world of boxing, the sport of boxing. That as far as PBC and what they are trying to provide for the boxing fans, it is really limited to whatever they can keep in-house. So anyone who's not a PBC fighter does not exist to the PBC. Thus, any titillating matches that may involve a fighter that's with another outfit, another organization, be it Top Rank or Matchroom or something else, the PBC is just gonna cover their eyes and act like they don't exist. How many of you boxing fans out there are okay with this? How many of you boxing fans out there are okay with the PBC pretending that fighters like Terrence Crawford don't even exist? You know, the sport of boxing consists of many moving parts. Moving parts that sometimes have to come together to make big situations happen.
Sometimes, yeah.
I mean, that's the sport. You have the sanctioning bodies, the different promotional outfits, and what networks they strike deals with. There are many moving parts in the sport of boxing, but if PBC insists on driving a wedge between their stable of fighters and everyone else that's out there, it will come as a detriment to the sport as a whole. That will prevent the kind of sizzling and titillating matches that bring money into the sport. That will prevent those kinds of fights from happening. And if money doesn't come into the sport, it's going to fade further into the background. I mean, the sport of boxing is already not a mainstream sport in this country, yet in this country lies the richest history for the sport of boxing. Some of the greatest fighters that have ever laced the gloves up came from right here in the US of A. But as of late, the sport of boxing is no longer a mainstream sport. Many people would describe the reason for that as being that there's too much red tape, there's too much bureaucracy, there's too many politics. The best aren't fighting the best.
And this ain't helping.
The fact of the matter is, for that kind of an environment to exist, there has to be bipartisanship. There have to be olive branches extended. You have to at times, not always, but at times, be willing to work with others. Whereas with the PBC, they seem to have taken their island policy a step further by not even acknowledging that there are other champions that are out there. In this particular instance, that's what they're doing with the WBO.
At least right now.
So what does that mean as far as other WBO champions that are in other weight classes? Champions like Demetrius Andrade, he's the WBO middleweight champion. A lot of people out there have expressed an interest in seeing him square off against what is now the WBC champion, Jermall Charlo. Are you PBC fans out there telling me that you would prefer to see Jermall Charlo continue to fight guys like Brandon Adams instead of seeing him unify with a guy like Demetrius Andrade? Is that what you're telling me? Is that what you have convinced yourself of? That you no longer want to see the best versus the best in the sport of boxing. You just want to see the best of the best as far as what the PBC has to offer. Is that what you're telling yourself? So that's saying that you're okay with the PBC calling a guy like Gervonta Davis the very best guy at 130 pounds, even though he's not fighting the best guys at 130 pounds. I mean, when's the last time this guy really fought someone who was halfway good at 130 pounds? The plan seems to be to bring up whatever 126-pound fighters the PBC's got up to 130 just to keep Gervonta Davis busy. And you think that this is conducive towards the sport?
It's not.
Alienating the fighters from each other in a sport that thrives on competition?
It's not.
Pretending that an entire weight class doesn't exist so that you don't have to work with them? Do you think that this is going to bring more eyes and more money into the sport? You think this helps the sport of boxing thrive and return to the mainstream where it belongs? Do you think this is conducive towards that?
It's not.
You know, this weekend, we got a fight coming up, and it's a fantastic fight. It's a fantastic fight between the WBO's 140-pound champion, Maurice Hooker, a matchroom/DAZN guy, against Jose Ramirez, the WBC champion, a top-ranked/ESPN guy. That is a situation that was brought into fruition by two different promotional outfits that were willing to work with each other to make a good fight happen. Because as it stands, you could keep putting Maurice Hooker in showcase fights, but that's not going to get anybody's attention. And the same applies to Jose Ramirez. You could keep feeding that guy, tune-ups and gimme fights, but nobody's interested in that shit. If you really want to get people's attention, these are the kinds of situations that have to happen. So when a winner emerges, he will establish himself as the authority in a weight class. That's the kind of stuff that people want to see. The best versus the best. What they don't want to see is a whole truckload of showcase fights for the better portion of a year. And that's what PBC provides to their quote-unquote fans.
Flunkies.
How many showcase fights has Gervonta Davis been in the last, 1, 2 years? In all honesty, when's the last time that guy fought a halfway decent fighter?
What is he going to?
Look at Marcus Brown. That's a guy with 2 world title opportunities. That's what he is. He could fight for the WBC or he could fight for the WBA, but who's he fighting? Who is he fighting and what is he fighting for? He's fighting Jean Pascal for no world title at all. That's what they got him doing.
Oh, exciting.
What do you think is more interesting? Marcus Brown versus a Dimitri Bivol for the WBA title, or Marcus Brown versus Jean Pascal for no title at all? The same Jean Pascal that just got beat by Dimitri Bivol. But we've discussed these talking points many times in the past, so now let's discuss what this could mean for the future. By the PBC not acknowledging the WBO's welterweight champion, they only make him seem like that much more of a boogeyman. Oh yeah, that's the appearance that it gives off. That's the impression that there is a threat in the welterweight division whose name cannot be mentioned.
By the PBC kids.
And he whose name cannot be mentioned is the biggest threat to anyone with a belt at the weight. That's the impression that they give off. That is the message that they communicate to the boxing fans who they are attempting to appeal to by pretending that Terrence Crawford doesn't exist, that he's not there. The monster under the bed, hiding somewhere. That's the impression it gives off. In what is a sport that thrives off of competition and the appearance of the best fighting the best, these guys want to sell you that there's not another welterweight champion at the weight, that it's just Errol and Sean and Manny.
There is no Crawford.
This will cause more fans to be funneled to Terrence Crawford for sympathy of his plight, that he would like to fight the best fighters at the weight. He would like to, have those negotiations ironed out by the powers that be. But there's one party that simply doesn't want to allow that. You take it a step further and superimpose it to the rest of the sport of boxing, and what changes this might spark? The PBC's island policy, revamped, where they're no longer recognizing the WBO champions. You think about what might happen, and this could cause what other promotional powerhouses are out there, what other outfits exist in the sport of boxing, to work with each other more so than they already are. Because they know that in order for this sport to thrive, and the stables of fighters that are ranked within it, there has to be bipartisanship. So what could happen is alliances may be formed in opposition of the PBC's island policy. Yeah, that could happen. Look, the PBC can get away with what they're doing in the welterweight division. That's where they got the most ponies in the show, you understand. But the welterweight division is only one division. That's it.
That won't work.
It's the only in all honesty, that's the only division where they can get away with this
Everywhere
and
else.
still keep their guys busy. But if all you've really got is relegated to one weight class, that kind of a plan doesn't have much longevity tacked to it. So as a result of this, what I think may happen in the coming weeks and months is that we're going to see alliances form and those bonds.
We'll counteract this.
That network is going to thrive in the midst of all of this. That's what I think is going to happen. In other news, per Michael Benson, the WBO have now officially ordered Oscar Valdez to defend his featherweight world title against Shakur Stevenson next. A purse bid has been scheduled for Friday, August 2nd. But per Frank Espinoza, Oscar Valdez's manager, he had this to say. He said Valdez has been at featherweight for his whole career, defended his title 6 times successfully. It's no longer easy to make the weight, but will for Warrington or Frampton. He feels he deserves those names. To which Shakur Stevenson replied, so he would defend against Frampton, who has no belt, but not against me. Is that what you're saying? To which Frank Espinoza replied, Oscar Valdez wants a big name, either Warrington or Frampton, feels he deserves to fight with one of them, #boxing. I'm saying you have done nothing as a pro yet. Frampton has accomplished more. These are just my thoughts. Oscar Valdez is a world champion. So, regardless of Frank Espinoza's anecdotes in regards to Shakur Stevenson's career so far, that he hasn't done anything, at minimum what he's done is earn a title shot. And that's why the WBO is ordering this fight. And you know what? If Oscar Valdez, if he doesn't want to comply with that order, if he doesn't want to adhere to the responsibilities that come with being a champion, you know what? So be it. Come up out of that belt and hand it over to Shakur Stevenson. It's that simple. No one can fault Shakur Stevenson for the fight not happening when Oscar Valdez's people are openly
Putting a stop to it.
denying him the opportunity to fight for the belt. You can't get mad at Shakur and say that he hasn't fought anybody when the guy that he was supposed to fight doesn't want to fight him.
That's not his fault.
You think about the reasons that Frank Espinoza is giving for this fight not happening, that Oscar Valdez has been a featherweight his whole career, and he's reached a point to where he's struggling to make the weight, yet there don't seem to be any struggles when it's the name of Josh Warrington or the name of Carl Frampton that Oscar is targeting, that there don't seem to be any struggles making weight
For them.
when it's about them. But when you are tasked, when you are ordered to defend your title against your mandatory challenger, oh, now you're struggling to make the weight? You're not struggling with Josh, you're not struggling with Carl, but you're struggling when it's about Shakur. Look, you can either make the weight or you can't. And it really is that simple. That's not an opinion. That's not an anecdote. You can either make the prescribed weight to hold on to your world title, or you can't. Whereas what Frank Espinoza is suggesting is far more selective and far more specific, to where Oscar Valdez hasn't outgrown featherweight. He's just outgrown his responsibility to hold on to his belt, to defend it. That's what he's saying, because as far as making the weight, he seems to be able to make it for Josh Warrington. He seems to be able to make it for Carl Frampton. He just doesn't want to make it for Shakur Stevenson, at least per his own manager. Who knows what Oscar himself will have to say about all of this when the hard questions are asked. The impression that Frank's comment gives off is that Oscar and his team see no incentive in making the weight for Shakur Stevenson. They see no incentive in doing it. You'll notice that he says
He deserves it.
Oscar feels that he deserves those fights, in reference to Carl Frampton, in reference to Josh Warrington. To be completely transparent about this, those are more accomplished and more experienced professionals, bigger names than Shakur Stevenson is. I mean, they are bigger names, we have to admit that. But better still, what Frank is communicating is that Oscar sees an incentive to continue to make the weight that he's quote-unquote struggling to make. He sees enough of an incentive to make the weight for them. But in reference to Shakur, he doesn't see an incentive. So you're telling me that holding on to your own world title, your championship belt,
Your responsibility.
there's no incentive in doing that. There's no incentive in holding on to it by making the weight and defending it against Shakur Stevenson. But you do see an incentive in those guys, even though you're the one that's alleging that Shakur hasn't done anything.
No, okay.
Well, if he hasn't done anything, beating him should be easy, shouldn't it? But we all know that's not the case. Look, if Oscar Valdez's mandatory challenger was some unheralded guy from West Bubblefuck, if he weren't a highly touted prospect like Shakur Stevenson, who's well-groomed, who has an Olympic pedigree, if it weren't a guy like that, they'd likely defend that title in a heartbeat. they wouldn't have taken a position like this. They wouldn't be ready to sacrifice their belt, forfeit it, and hand it over to the next guy. Not if the mandatory challenger was some stiff.
Exactly.
But because they see that there are risks involved in a Shakur Stevenson fight,
It's a risky fight.
to them, they don't see an incentive to take on those risks.
That's pretty much it.
Now, the incentive that they're looking for is likely a financial incentive. That, fighting Josh Warrington gets you more money than fighting Shakur Stevenson. Or fighting Carl Frampton gets you more money than fighting Shakur Stevenson. And there's truth in that. I mean, I do think so. That, yeah, those fights would yield more of a financial incentive than a Shakur Stevenson fight would. That kid's just developing. He's building his fan base. But think about it this way. What that communicates is that the financial reward is not big enough for you to take on these risks. And the risks denote the duck, because that's what this looks like. When you're faced with a situation that you characterize as being too risky, there's not a big enough incentive for you to take on that risk.
It's not worth it.
That essentially means that you don't want to take a chance on that fighter.
It's not worth it.
The payday is just not as big as you want it to be for you to take on that risk. But the risk itself is the focal point. You view it as a risky fight. You view it as a fight where you'd be taking a chance that there is a chance that you could lose that fight. And because the incentive isn't big enough for you, you don't want to take that risk.
That chance.
But how do we know that Frank Espinoza looks at it as a risky fight? Because he didn't actually say that verbatim. We're making that inference based on the position that he's taking. How do we know that Frank Espinoza views Shakur Stevenson as a risky fight with almost no reward? How do we know? Well, you'll notice that Oscar Valdez fought not just one, but two undefeated guys back-to-back. He was willing to take on those guys.
Tomazon and Sanchez.
And neither one of those guys has the profile or brings the financial incentive of a Josh Warrington or a Carl Frampton, yet Oscar fought them anyway. He fought them regardless. Whereas in the case of Shakur Stevenson,
They don't want to.
At least his team, at least Frank Espinoza, doesn't seem as willing to allow it.
Even though it's in order.
And that's where you can make the inference that they don't look at it as an easy fight. They don't look at it as being as winnable a fight, at least, as the aforementioned fights with the aforementioned fighters. Because if they did, they'd have decided to fight Shakur the same way they decided to fight those guys. So it's safe to say that they must see something in Shakur that they didn't see in those other guys. Because they were actually willing to fight those guys. Whereas here, apparently it's not something that they feel like doing. And whatever it is they see in Shakur Stevenson, it must be something that they don't like.